This all started a few weeks back when I was trying to make a procedural sine wave for some sci-fi screen stuff. Initially, I had made one that used a math node that kind of looked like this setup, but one day when I was away from my desk, I had another idea to use two wave texture nodes instead and have one influence the location of the second one. Then when I played around with that setup, I found it could make some pretty interesting variations with very little effort. So I'm going to show you how to set up these 9 variations I made. Also, thank you to my patrons and Gumroad supporters. Appreciate the support. To set up our scene, I'm just going to get rid of this cube and bring in a plane. I'm going to go from top down here and just tab into edit mode and quickly size it along the x-axis by 1.78. Just kind of get a widescreen definition here. It's basically 16:9. I'm going to change the top right to my 3D viewport, make it a little larger, and let's hold down Z and move your mouse up to be in rendered mode there. And then I'm going to make the whole middle area my shader editor, just so we have lots of room while we're working here. I'm going to hit N to get rid of that shelf on the right and just bring up my material that was on the cube. And to get rid of this principal BSDF, not really going to use it. And I'm going to bring in a texture coordinate node, because it comes in faster if you type in coordinate. And let's come out of the object here, and I'm going to bring in a mapping node and just place it right here. I'll bring in a wave texture and place it right after here, and we can see a bunch of vertical lines. I'm going to lower the scale on this wave texture to 0.6, so it's a much larger pattern. Move this texture coordinate back a little bit and grab both of these nodes here and hit Control-Shift-D, and that duplicates both of these nodes while leaving them attached to this node right here. I'm going to change it from Y to X on this top wave texture, and I'll change the scale to something slightly smaller here. Let's check this out. So if we adjust the scale, we can see it gets larger and smaller. So I'm going to set it at 0.2. So let's look at this first wave texture we put down here. If I move the Y coordinate right here, then it moves it up and down there. And if I can only move it in some places, that would be kind of useful. So what I did is I plugged, actually either of these outputs will work fine because they're actually the same thing as far as I can tell. I don't think there's any difference between the color and the factor output of a wave texture. But we're going to plug it into this location right here. And let's see what that does. So it's already created kind of a repeating sine wave for us. Let's bring in a mix RGB so we can see what's happening here a bit better. I'm going to plug this into the top and this into the bottom here. And so this is them mixed together. And basically the black areas here, those are where we have these high points. And the white areas are these low points here. I'm going to get rid of this mix RGB. And I'm just going to manipulate this mapping node. I'm going to set the Y value under scale to 4.8. So it's a little flatter this way. And I'm going to bring in a color ramp and just place it right after here. And let's bring the black to 0.16, something like that. And this white is going to come down right below it to 0.14. So we have mostly black, a little bit of white there. The last thing I want to do is just something between this mapping and wave texture node, just to kind of limit the range of what's going on here. To do that, I'm going to bring in 3 nodes. I'm going to bring in a separate XYZ. I'll just make a bit more room. Separate XYZ, and then a math node, and then a mix RGB. I'm going to plug the mapping node into the separate XYZ, the Y into the top value of the math node, and I'm going to set this math node to compare. And then let's set the value to 0.89 and the epsilon to 0.36. See what that's doing. It's basically just limiting this to a narrow range. This is the range right here, and this is where the range sits on the y-axis there. Then I'm just going to use this mix RGB. This compare is going to go into the factor, and then this is going to go into color 2. So then we kind of get a combination between the two there, and I'm going to set this at white. Then this is going to go into the vector on the wave texture. And let's see that output. The last thing I'm going to do is just add a math node right after this wave texture here. And I'll just set this to multiply. And this is going to help us control the magnitude of that effect of this first wave texture on this second one here. So I'm just going to set this at 1.5, but set it however you want. It doesn't quite look right. The background should be white, so maybe this mix RGB. Yeah, it's just not set to completely white there. So there we go. There's texture 1. Just going to name this material period 001, and then I'll just duplicate this and move this to the right here for now. And I'll grab this and just click this button here, which makes a new material. And because I named it 0.001, this is now 0.002, and it's just a little easier that way. So material 0.002 is exactly the same as 0.001, except this sign value here, I'm just going to change this to triangle. And there we go. I think as well, maybe I did, yeah, a little bit bigger. Yeah, 0.5. There we go. In fact, this is kind of interesting here, you know, this interpolation, the triangle, sine, saw, whatever. It's an interesting way to visualize it. You know, there's saw, for instance. I'm going to grab this texture, just duplicate it, move it to the right there. And let's grab this texture here and just click this button again. It should say material.003 if you renamed it the same as I did. For this third texture, I'm just going to erase all these nodes and start again. Even though the setup is fairly straightforward, I think it'll just be confusing if I do it that way. So just got my texture coordinate node, and that's going to go into, that's going to go into a mapping node. And by the way, it's good to, you know, when you work on this new texture, just make sure you're not also changing this texture you were just working on. And you did successfully create a new texture, so it saved you a lot of heartache there. So anyways, the mapping node is going to go into a wave texture node. And I'm going to go a little faster on this one because I kind of explained it a bit more in that first one. But this is going to go into a math node set to multiply. And I'm going to grab both of these nodes here, the mapping and wave texture, duplicate them, place them here, and this multiply is going to go into the location. On this first wave texture, I'm going to set the scale to 2, and I'm going to change it from bands to rings, and then from X to spherical. I'll leave it on sine. For this multiply, I'm going to change this to 5.4. For this wave texture here, let's take a look at this. I'm going to change this to Y, and to we'll change the scale to much lower, to 0.2, something like that. 0.04 actually, that's what I should have there. Yeah, there we go. That 0.2 actually looks really cool, but 0.04 is what I had there. I'm going to feed this into a color ramp, and I'm going to set the black at 0.16, and I'll bring the white just down below it at 0.13. Then I'm going to bring in those couple nodes just in between this mapping and wave texture like I did for the first texture. I'm going to bring in a separate XYZ, plug that in here. And for the Y output, that's going to go into a math node, which I'll set to compare. And then this is all going to go into a mix RGB, just into the factor. And this mapping node is going to go into color 2. I'm just going to set this color 1 to white. Then I'll plug this mix RGB output into the wave texture. Let's see what we've got. The last thing I need to adjust is this compare node. So I'll set the value to 0.89 and the epsilon to 1.36. Then on this mapping node, I'm just going to set the Y scale value to 4.8. And there we go. We've got texture number 3. I'm going to grab this texture here, hit Shift D, just move it to the right. And let's grab this texture here and hit this button. So we're now working on material 4. Okay, I'm just going to grab everything except for that texture coordinate and delete it. We'll just start from scratch here again. And I'm going to go to Object, and then I'll just bring in the same kind of setup as before, mapping node, wave texture. We'll just move these up here. I'm going to hit Control-Shift-D, plug this color into the location on that bottom one, and just bring in a math node. Set this to multiply, and I'm going to set the value to 0.2. For this wave texture up here, we're going to go to Y, and then triangle, and then for scale, I'm going to set it at 3, the distortion is going to be 5, and the detail is going to be 0. In the second wave texture, I'm going to set it to 0.6 for the scale, and then we'll set up a color ramp right after here. I'm going to bring the black to 0.18, and the white is going to come down to 0.24. Then I just need to set this to Y instead of X. There we go. So that is texture number 4. A lot of neat things you can play around with on this one here. You could up the distortion. That looks pretty interesting. The multiply, I guess it looks pretty confusing if you do that. But then this mapping node here, you get some interesting things here. If you rotate the X, there's something. Same with the Z. It's pretty interesting. And then with the scaling, the Y scaling looks pretty interesting around 4 to 6. It's kind of cool. Okay, on to texture 5. Let's grab this one here, and I'm just going to move it down here, maybe a little bit lower. Looks good. Let's grab this texture, hit this button. So we should now be working with material 5 there. Just going to grab all of these nodes except for the texture coordinate and delete them. And let's come out of object. I'm going to add in a mapping node, then a wave texture. Place it there, and we'll just hit Control-Shift-D, duplicate these guys here. I'm going to plug the color into the location here, and bring in a math node, and set this to multiply. Change the scale on this first wave texture to 0.2, and change it from sine to triangle. Change multiply to 1.5, and let's look at this output here. I'm going to set the second scale or the scale on the second wave texture to 0.6, and I'm going to change this to Y. I'm going to come over to this first mapping node and change the Z rotation to -80. And then I'm going to change the X scale to something quite a bit higher. Let's go to 20. And then I'll just add a color ramp at the end. I found this one a lot of fun to play around with, especially if you animate the Z rotation on this second mapping node right here. It's a pretty interesting pattern. I'm going to grab this texture now that we're done with it and just move it somewhere around here. And let's grab this and just click this button. We'll create a new material. This is material 6 now. And let's start creating it. Okay, so for this one here, I'm just going to delete everything. And let's go ahead and just set up basically the same thing again. Just want to do it from scratch. So a mapping node, a wave texture, grab both of these, hit Control-Shift-D. Then I'm going to add this color into the location on that second mapping node. And I won't worry about a multiply node. I guess I didn't have one there. So then in between here, I'm going to put 3 more nodes. I'm going to put a separate X, Y, Z. And I'm going to feed the Y into a math node that is set to compare. Then I'm going to bring in a mix RGB, feed this into the factor, and then feed the vector output from that second mapping node into color 2. And then the color output is going to go into the vector input of this second wave texture here. On this first wave texture, I'm going to set the scale to 0.2, the distortion to 15, and then the detail to, I think it was 10? Yeah, that's right, 10. So, it really depends on what you're doing. What I like to do is just kind of zoom in a little bit and just play with that detail, because a lot of times it won't make much of a difference over, 5 or 7 or something like that. In this particular setup, I didn't really notice any difference above 10, so I thought 10 would be, fine to turn up. It does use more processing power, so don't just turn it up for no reason. On the second mapping node, I'm going to set the Y scale to 4.8. On the compare node, I'm going to set the value to 2.59, and the epsilon is going to be 0.76. For this mix factor, or pardon me, this mix color 1, I'm going to set color 1 to white. Just make sure it's all the way at the top there. Then for this wave texture, I'm going to set the scale to 0.6, and I'm going to change it from X to Y. Here we go. Then I'm going to feed all of this into a Voronoi texture. And let's set the scale to 10. I'm going to change the Voronoi type to distance to edge. And let's look at that output. There's one last thing actually I was supposed to do here. There was supposed to be a math node here. I just didn't have it written down correctly. So it's going to be multiply, and I'm going to set this to 3.1. Then let's look at this color ramp at the end. It's going to help us just create some contrast, I'm going to bring the black up to 0.23, and I'll bring the white down just below it at 0.19. And there we go. This is texture 6. I'm going to grab this mesh here, just move it over here, and let's rename this one here by clicking this button. It'll now be Material 7. Texture 7 is actually very similar to Texture 6, so I'm just going to start with that and work from there. So I've got Texture 6 here, renamed it to Texture 7, and I'm going to go to this Compare node, and I'm going to change it to 0.89 instead of 0.76. So that's just going to move it up and down a little bit. It's pretty interesting. And then this color ramp, we're going to change the black position to 0.41, so a little higher there, and the white is going to come up to 0.22. I'm going to change this Voronoi node at the end to F1, and then let's come out of the color output as well. It doesn't really matter. You can always change it, but then I'm going to change the detail roughness on this first wave texture. I'm just going to drag it across to 1, and there we go. We've got texture 7. I thought this texture had a pretty cool stained concrete look to it. Anyways, let's do texture 8 here. So I'm just going to move this into position somewhere around there. Looks pretty good. And let's grab this texture and just click this button. We'll rename it to texture 8. And then I'm going to delete everything except for that texture coordinate node at the beginning. Let's just come out of object. So I'm just going to set up all the nodes for this guy real quick. Bring in a mapping node and a wave texture. Move these up, hit Control-Shift-D. Let's select this color output and bring it into the location on that second mapping node. And I'll bring in a math node and just set this to multiply. Move this over a little bit, and I'm going to bring in a separate XYZ, a math node, and a mix RGB. And then at the very end, I'll just bring in a color ramp. For this wave texture, I'm going to set the scale to 0.4. The distortion is going to be pretty high. It's going to be at 100. And for this multiply, I'm going to set this at -3.3. Let's go along to this mapping node. This is going to go into the separate XYZ, and the Y output is going to go into that value there. I'm going to set this at compare. So this value right here, I'm going to set this at -1.4. See what we're doing while we're doing it here. And then the epsilon is going to be at 0.5. Yeah, so this just moves around the area of influence, or pardon me, this moves around the area of influence, and this controls kind of the magnitude of the area of influence there. And this is going to go into the factor on this mix RGB. Color 1 is going to be white, and this vector output is going to go into color 2. I'm going to feed this into the vector on that wave texture. Let's look at that there, and this is going to go into the color ramp here. This wave texture at the end, I'm going to set the scale to 0.6, and I'm going to change this from X to Y. Then this color ramp, let's bring this black up to 0.14, and the white is just going to be above it at 0.16. Just had these backwards. The black should be at the top, white should be at the bottom. So white is at 0.14, and black is at 0.16. Is that what it was? Yeah, that's right. And then something here is not quite right. Oh yeah, it's this Y scale. This should be 0.4 or 4.8, pardon me. There we go. So there we go. We've got texture 8. I think this one is especially fun to play with the compare node there. You can see this value moves the range up and down. This kind of controls the magnitude of the range. All right, I'm just going to move this into position here. And you know what? This last texture, because some of these are slightly off, whatever. Doesn't really matter. This last texture is actually going to be really similar to this first texture. So I'm just going to assign that first texture to this mesh here. And let's just hit this button, and we'll create material 9. But now it'll just be the first texture. We'll just base it off of that. So starting from where we left off when we made texture 1, I'm just going to move the texture coordinate over a little bit and grab these three nodes, the mapping, wave texture, and the multiply node, and hit Control Shift D. And so that duplicates everything without removing that connection at the beginning there. And I'm also going to duplicate this mapping node and put it right here. And I'm going to run this into that first one, this multiply into that first mapping node. I'm going to change this first multiply to -3, and this second multiply is going to be 6. And this wave texture right here, I'm just going to change this from sine to triangle. I'm also going to change the scale to 1. I'm going to come over to this compare node and change it to a different epsilon value. I'm going to go 3.2 just to make it thicker. And I'm going to change this scale and this wave texture to 0.2, so it's a little bit thinner there. And then this color ramp, I'm going to bring the white up to 0.73. And the black is going to come up as well. It's going to come up only to 0.6 though. So this is just an example of taking it kind of one step further, trying to add on to a chain at the beginning here. We've got the saw and then the overarching sine pattern, each controlled by, the triangle and the sine right here. I guess I should have said triangle instead of saw, because saw is already a name for a different one. So a lot of parameters to change around here to play around with. One that I think looks kind of cool is the phase offset. That looks pretty neat with the sine and with the triangle there. They're just kind of moving back and forth. This one doesn't really have the same effect. Another thing that's kind of cool is, this compare node. It's pretty interesting to play around with that guy. You could try changing some stuff on this mapping nodes as well. Give some interesting effects, and maybe playing around with this distortion as well. Get some cool things there too. One thing to keep in mind is these multiply nodes are controlling how much of an effect these wave textures have as well. So playing around with those can yield some really cool results. Okay, that's it for today. Hope you could see what I was doing and how you might change it around. With these kind of textures, there's a huge potential for variation, and it can be kind of overwhelming. I would just start by changing parameters, changing values in different areas there, and just see if you can come up with something cool. You never know what you might stumble onto. Thanks for watching.